The Veryovkina Cave, with a depth of 7,257 feet, holds the record for being the deepest cave on our planet. It's so deep that it requires over 4 days and a vast amount of rope to reach its profound depths. This cave has been the site of several chilling incidents. Located on the border between Russia and Georgia, the Caucasus Mountains are home to the cave. This mountain range is renowned for several reasons. It houses Europe's highest peak, Mount Elbrus, which stands at an impressive 18,500 feet. The Gagra Range, a sub-range of the Caucasus Mountains located on the western side of Abkhazia, is also noteworthy. This range, primarily composed of limestone and shaped by rivers throughout its geological history, boasts some significant mountains. The tallest among them reaches just over 11,000 feet. However, the Gagra Range is famous for another reason. Over time, prehistoric rivers have carved out deep canyons and the largest known caves on Earth in this range. Among these, the Gagra Mountains house 4 of the world's deepest caves, with the Veryovkina Cave being the deepest at over 7,000 feet deep. To put this into perspective, this depth is equivalent to stacking 23 Statue of Liberty on top of each other. The entrance to the Veryovkina Cave is situated at an altitude of 7,500 feet, which means one has to scale a literal mountain to reach it. Once at the top, you are still surrounded by the rocky cliffs of the mountain ranges, and nestled among these cliffs is a seemingly ordinary hole in the ground. This hole, clearly the entrance to a cave, unexpectedly descends over a mile into the earth. The cave was first discovered in 1968 by a group of cavers who only managed to descend to a depth of 377 feet before returning to the surface. In 1983, the cave was rediscovered by a separate team of speleologists from the Perovo Speleo Club in Moscow. In the 3 years following its rediscovery, a series of expeditions managed to explore the cave to a depth of approximately 1,400 feet. However, for reasons that remain unclear, these expeditions ceased until the year 2000. Exploration resumed in 2000, but it wasn't until 2015 that a new shaft was discovered, revealing the true depth of the Veryovkina Cave. By 2017, the maximum depth of the cave had been extended from 1,400 feet to an astounding 7,200 feet, with over 17 kilometers of tunnels and passages mapped. In March of 2018, the deepest point of the cave was finally discovered at the bottom of a subterranean lake where the cave meets the water table. This discovery confirmed the total depth of the Veryovkina Cave to be 7,257 feet. 6 months later, in September, the Perovo team returned to continue exploring the cave. This time, they were accompanied by photographers Robbie Schoen and Jeff Wade. The same team of world-class cavers from the Perovo Club, led by team leader Pavel Demidov, had made all the significant descents of Veryovkina and other deep caves in the Gagra mountain range. This expedition aimed to collect samples of potentially undiscovered species and explore promising horizontal passages at the bottom of the cave, all while being documented by Robbie and Jeff. In a moderately deep cave, where descent and ascent can be achieved in a single day, a significant amount of equipment is still required, including food and climbing gear for each team member. However, in caves as vast as the Veryovkina Cave, the descent is more akin to a mountain climbing expedition. If you're familiar with Mount Everest expeditions, you might have heard of the multi-camp system. This system is also employed in the exploration of the Veryovkina Cave due to its immense depth. In the exploration of deep caves or high mountains, a multi-camp system is often employed. These camps, established at increasing heights or depths, serve as storage for food and gear, and provide a place for climbers to rest. The sheer volume of necessary equipment for multi-day expeditions makes it impossible to transport everything at once. Therefore, climbers must make multiple trips to transport the equipment, ensuring a safe attempt. The Veryovkina Cave is no exception to this rule. Given its extraordinary depth, the cave has 6 camps at various depths leading to the bottom. From the entrance, explorers don special clothing, harnesses, and helmets equipped with headlamps before descending the first shaft into the darkness. They navigate through a series of narrow tunnels and passages to reach the first camp at 2,000 feet. This camp is a permanent installation where gear and equipment are stored year-round for emergencies. Over the next 4 days, photographers Robbie, Jeff, and the Perovo Speleo Club journeyed to Camp 6, located at a depth of 6,900 feet, 2,103 meters. The temperature during their descent was just above freezing. They crawled through mud and water, navigated through incredibly tight spaces, and descended down a 100-foot, 30.5-meter shaft suspended over nothing but air. The thousands of feet of ropes used for the descent were their only means of transportation in and out of the cave. Upon reaching the flat, sandy Camp 6, set up in a large horizontal tunnel, they made it their home for the remainder of the expedition. Over the next 3 days, the team set out from their camp to complete their planned tasks. One of these tasks was to guide Robbie and Jeff to the lake at the bottom of the cave. Upon reaching the lake, they were awestruck by the sight of the beautiful turquoise water surrounded by jet-black limestone. The lake measures 50 feet long, 15.24 min, 25 feet, 7.6 min, wide, and is actually 28 feet, 8.5 min, deep. On the 7th day of the expedition, everything was proceeding as planned. However, 2 team members had to depart early to catch a flight. As they ascended to Camp 3, they encountered a significant amount of water flooding into the cave. A severe storm on the surface had triggered a flood pulse, causing thousands of liters of water to rush into the cave. Wireless communication is impossible within these caves due to the thick layers of rock. Therefore, cavers run a physical line throughout the length of the cave for communication. The 2 team members quickly connected to this cable to alert the others about the impending flood pulse. Initially, the team at Camp 6 wasn't overly concerned when they received the warning. Flood pulses are a common hazard for cavers. A single millimeter of rain translates to 1 liter of water per square meter, meaning a single square kilometer receives 1,000 liters of water from just a millimeter of rainfall. During heavy rain, this volume increases significantly. This water then cascades into caves in equally large volumes and can persist for hours, depending on the rainfall volume and duration. The Veryovkina group, being world-class cavers, planned to monitor the water level and adjust their plans accordingly. Camp 6 was strategically set up away from the main vertical shaft, in an area that seemed to be out of the water's flow path. It was also located at a depth of 6,900 feet, while the total depth of the cave exceeded 7,200 feet. For the water to reach them, it would have to fill up 300 feet of passages below them. However, about half an hour after receiving the warning, they heard the ominous sound of approaching water. The sound began as a distant rumble, gradually intensifying like an approaching train. By the time it neared the camp, it was a deafening roar that made the entire cave vibrate as if caught in a perpetual earthquake. Robbie had just begun preparing breakfast when the noise escalated. He and the others hurried out of their tents to witness the impending deluge. As they directed their headlights towards the vertical shaft, a torrent of water cascaded down. Robbie, stunned by the sight, nearly dropped the food he was holding. Although he was less experienced than the Veryovkina team, he tried to remain calm like his Russian colleagues, despite his concern about the volume and speed of the incoming water. Their location remained dry, which offered some reassurance. 2 hours into the flooding, with no signs of abatement, one of the team members heard a gurgling sound emanating from a small hole near the tent. Although he couldn't see any water in the hole, he thought it prudent to inform the team leader. Pavel, sharing the concern, decided to inspect a nearby siphon to gauge the rise in the water table. Upon their return 5 minutes later, they checked the hole again. This time, they could see water, and it was rising so rapidly that it was splashing against the walls and nearly overflowing from the hole. The team member turned to Robbie, his face drained of color. Robbie immediately understood that they needed to evacuate immediately. Amid the deafening sound of rushing water, chaos ensued in the camp. The unexpected need to evacuate sent everyone into a flurry of activity, hastily packing essential gear. Robbie and Jeff donned their latex suits over their fleece-based layers, followed by their abrasion-resistant nylon shells and harnesses. Faced with a difficult decision, Robbie chose to leave behind all his camera equipment and personal items, a collection worth tens of thousands of dollars. He understood the potential risk of being slowed down, which could endanger his life or those of his teammates. He removed all the memory cards from the cameras, placed them in a Ziploc bag, and tucked them into his latex suit, hoping to at least preserve the images he had captured. With that, he informed the others that he and Jeff would begin their ascent, and they set off towards the vertical shaft leading out of the rapidly flooding Camp 6. This would be their last interaction with the Russians at Camp 6, who decided to wait for their team leader, Pavel, before starting their ascent. As Robbie and Jeff approached the vertical ropes, they came across a narrow traverse, akin to a bridge along one wall. Before the flood, the chamber next to the bridge was a 60-foot, 18.3 meter deep and 25-foot, 7.6 meter wide void. Now, it was nearly filled with water, almost spilling over the edge of the bridge. At the end of this narrow traverse, where the vertical ropes hung, was the source of the water flooding the cave. Stepping into the waterfall cascading down from the shaft, Robbie attached his ascenders to the rope. He then lowered his head, took a deep breath, and began his ascent up the rope, battling the relentless onslaught of water from above. The force of the water was so intense that it felt as if it was crushing him, almost as if his head was being pushed into his shoulders. Fortunately, Robbie was able to tuck his chin, allowing the water to flow off his helmet and create a small pocket of air for him to breathe. He focused on the white rope directly in front of his face, rhythmically moving his ascenders up as quickly as he could. Upon reaching a small outcropping, he was able to step out of the waterfall and look upwards. He saw that the rope emerged from a hole in the rocks, which was also the source of the water. A torrent of water was gushing out of this small hole, filling the entire space. Robbie doubted his ability to navigate through the intense downpour, but he knew he couldn't stop. As the lead climber, he had a responsibility to the others following him, and there was no way to know the conditions they were facing below. He decided to attempt the passage. The force of the water was so strong that he could only move his ascenders a few inches at a time. After a strenuous effort, he managed to squeeze through. Realizing that Jeff would have to undergo the same ordeal, Robbie continued climbing to clear the way. In his panic, he hadn't noticed that this new section of the cave was mostly dry, with the water taking a different route. However, adrenaline kept him climbing relentlessly. It was only when Jeff called out to him to slow down that he came to his senses. He paused, allowing Jeff to catch up before they continued their ascent. When Jeff reached him, his face was pale and his eyes wide, but he expressed relief that they were both alive. They couldn't help but worry about the fate of the Veryovkina team still below. Robbie and Jeff eventually reached Camp 5 at 6,200 feet, 1,290, where they waited, hoping to see the Russians emerge at any moment. As the cave trembled around them, they occasionally peered down into the abyss. To their relief, they spotted a single headlamp slowly ascending the shaft. It was Andrei. When he finally reached them, they inquired about the others, but he could only shake his head in silence. They sat there, contemplating the worst-case scenario. By the time Pavel had returned from the siphon, the bridge that Robbie and Jeff had crossed was entirely underwater. The remaining team members had to swim to reach the vertical ropes. Pavel, the last to swim out, found himself in a swirling vortex as the chamber had become a giant whirlpool due to the water draining deeper into the cave. He had to swim hard against the current to reach the line. By the time they began their ascent, all the deeper passages were completely submerged. 15 minutes after Andrei's arrival, 5 more lights were seen ascending the shaft. One by one, the remaining members of the Veryovkina team climbed up to Camp 5. Robbie watched them ascend from the flooded passage, awestruck by their strength and capability. One team member even managed to carry a stove and 4 sleeping bags attached to his harness. Robbie felt a sense of relief that he and Jeff had been the first to ascend. Had they been the last, they might not have survived. Upon reaching the camp, the team quickly settled into the tent, brewing coffee and laughing about their ordeal. Robbie, however, was still shaken. For hours, he refused to remove his gear and kept checking the chasm to see if the water was still rising. A horizontal passage, 200 feet, 61 meters above them, was their next obstacle to ascend further into the cave. Under normal circumstances, a horizontal passage they needed to traverse was already half filled with water, requiring them to crawl through it. However, due to the flooding, it was completely submerged. As long as the flooding persisted, they were trapped, hoping that the water wouldn't rise any further. Pavel reassured Robbie that they would wait until morning for the water to recede. Over the next 16 hours at the camp, the roaring of the water gradually subsided. The flood pulse, which lasted a total of 20 hours, was the result of a week of rain followed by a severe storm. The week-long rain had saturated the ground, so when the storm hit, water poured relentlessly into the Veryovkina Cave. They later learned from a cab driver that the raindrops from the storm had been the size of nickels. This incident served as a valuable learning experience for the team. They had previously believed that the cave only flooded in the winter. After the expedition, They implemented plans to enhance surface monitoring for rainfall. They also installed another camp in the lower chambers to provide an additional escape route in case of flooding. Despite the expedition being cut short, they had essentially accomplished everything they had set out to do. New passages were explored and mapped, cave species were sampled, and although the camera equipment was lost, all the pictures were preserved. However, this wouldn't be the last mishap in the Veryovkina Cave. 2 years later, in November 2020, explorers noticed a rope fixed at the cave's entrance, a significant safety concern in the caving world, as it could allow unprepared individuals to access the cave and potentially get hurt or lost. 8 months later, in August 2021, the same Perovo team returned to continue their work in the Veryovkina Cave. 3 years after their previous expedition, the Perovo team descended into the Veryovkina Cave once again. However, at a depth of 1,300 feet, 396 meters, they discovered a pair of crampons and an ice axe. The presence of this equipment deep within the cave was puzzling, as it couldn't have simply fallen from the entrance due to the absence of direct drops to the location where the equipment was found. This indicated that someone had ventured deep into the cave. The team continued their descent, reaching the permanent camp at 2,000 feet, 610 meters. Then the second camp at 3,200 feet, 975 meters. And finally arriving at a depth of 3,600 feet, 1,097 meters. Here, halfway into the deepest cave on Earth, they discovered the badly decomposed body of a man. He was dressed in camouflage overalls, tracking boots, a helmet, and was still attached to the rope he had used to descend into the cave. He also had 2 cell phones with him. The state of decomposition suggested that he had been there for several months. Although the man carried no identification, authorities were able to identify him as 37-year-old Sergei Kozev, using a missing persons database. Information retrieved from the cell phones provided insights into the events leading to his demise. Sergei, a resident of Sochi, Russia, was an avid outdoorsman who frequently embarked on solo expeditions to explore the wilderness. On November 1st, 2020, he bid farewell to his family for one such expedition, heading for the Gagra Mountains. He did not disclose his destination, despite the fact that it was a location less frequently visited than the International Space Station. Documents and screenshots found on his phone revealed that Sergei had spent almost a year planning this trip. He had printed out maps and materials from the expeditions conducted by the Perovo team, specifically to navigate down into the cave. Sergei began his journey by ascending the mountains to the cave entrance, using his crampons and ice axe. He then secured a rope to the entrance and descended into the darkness of the Veryovkina Cave. Leveraging the information he had gathered from the Perovo team, he transported all his equipment in 3 bags through the tunnels and narrow passages. Using a lattice descender, he navigated the vast vertical shafts alone. He successfully reached the first camp, left some equipment there, and then almost immediately proceeded to the second camp. Evidence suggests that he stayed at the second camp for about a week before descending further into the cave. Beyond the second camp, the cave exploration became more challenging due to larger and more technically demanding vertical shafts. Additionally, the cave became significantly wetter from that point onward. As any experienced caver knows, having the right equipment is crucial. A standard fleece underlayer with a waterproof outer layer is essential for surviving the cold and wet subterranean environment. It's unclear exactly what transpired in Sergei's final moments, but it seems he realized that he couldn't descend any further through the water with his current equipment. He likely attempted to ascend back up the cave, but due to the technical challenges of the area he had descended into, he was unable to exit. Sergei had brought hand ascenders, but he didn't have any stirrups for his feet, meaning he had no footholds for the long vertical shafts. This lack of proper equipment may have contributed to his inability to escape. Sergei must have struggled to escape the cave, but between exhaustion and the cold, he eventually succumbed to sleep and never woke up. Upon discovering his body, the Perovo team ascended to the surface and alerted the authorities. Given the cave's complexity and the depth at which Sergei's body was found, it took a team of over 100 individuals to retrieve it. Being in a confined space like a cave with a decomposing body is particularly risky due to the potential buildup of toxic gases from the decomposition process. Despite the large number of people involved in the rescue, they had to dismember Sergei to successfully remove him from the cave. After his retrieval, his body was finally returned to his wife and children in Sochi. As of now, the Veryovkina Cave holds the title of the deepest cave on Earth. However, the Earth is vast, and caves are not as easily observable as mountains. The Veryovkina Cave was only declared the deepest in 2018, and it remains to be seen whether it will retain this title.